kids, welcome back. This morning we are going to talk about remembering. In fact, our Bible point for today is don't forget to remember. And every time you hear me say that, I want you to respond with thank you, God. Okay, so let's try that. Ready? Don't forget to remember. Nice. Let's do it one more time. This time I want you to do it standing on one foot. So hop up from wherever you are, stand on one foot. Are you ready? Don't forget to remember. Thank you, God. Remembering is actually something that's very important to God. The act of remembering is mentioned in just the Old Testament alone 130 times. That means remembering must be really important to God. And if it's really important to God, it should be really important to us as well. So I've got this poster up, which you've already seen before. We were there not too long ago in the story of Moses. And remember, Moses and his people had been slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years, and God was going to set his people free. And he used Moses to do that. But the night before they were set free, God sent a final plague on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. But to protect God's people from this plague, he instructed them to take the blood of a lamb and paint it on the doorpost of their house. And that night, when death swept through the land, if it saw the blood of the lamb, death would pass over that house. This was a miracle of God. It was a miracle that God used to set his people free, this whole thing. So, when we think about remembering, and when we look back in the Old Testament, God actually gave his people lots of different ways to remember. But one of them in particular was to remember this act of a blood of a lamb and death seeing the blood of the lamb and passing over. In fact, after that event, he told all of his people every year, get together and remember how I set you free from being slaves in Egypt by the blood of a lamb. And so for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, God's people would gather together once a year to celebrate the Passover. Now, we mentioned this a little bit before Easter, but that week between Palm Sunday and Easter, all of God's people were gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, just like God had instructed them to do, to remember. Don't forget to remember. That's right. Thank you, God. Because God knows that when we forget, we fall into sin. We stop trusting him. So he instructed his people, don't forget to remember. And they would gather together every year to remember being set free by the blood of the Lamb. So Jesus was there in Jerusalem with his disciples, celebrating the Passover together. But that night, Jesus changed the meaning of Passover. He took it from because it was like there was a script they would follow. Like God had told them, say this, say this, say this, so that their act of remembering was something that they could do succinctly every year. But Jesus kind of changed the way that Passover happened for his disciples that year. So that is our Bible truth today. And actually what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read to you out of this Bible, the Laugh and Learn Bible for Kids, which gives this great explanation that will show us what Passover is and to remind us, don't forget to remember. All right, I'll be back with you soon.
Jesus and his disciples walked to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. What was Passover? Remember when God rescued the Israelites from Egypt by sending plagues of frogs and flies and darkness? Remember the angel God sent to kill the firstborn sons of the Egyptians when Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go free? That angel passed over the homes of the Israelites if they had the blood of a lamb over their doors. The sons of Israel were saved by the blood of that lamb. Ever since that day, Israelites have celebrated Passover with a special meal, just like the one they had that night in Egypt many years earlier. So Jesus and his disciples traveled to Jerusalem for Passover. Lots of other people came too, and many of them had heard stories about Jesus. As Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, a big crowd of people came out to meet him. They laid down palm branches in front of him, which was a sign of royalty. They shouted, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And "Blessed is the coming kingdom of David." It was like a parade for a king. This made the Pharisees and Sadducees very nervous. Since Israel was a part of the Roman Empire, the Israelites weren't allowed to have their own king. The king of the Romans was Israel's king. Anytime someone in Israel said, "Let's have a new king," the Romans would send in soldiers and throw a bunch of people in prison, or worse. The Pharisees and Sadducees had to do something to stop all the commotion about Jesus and this talk of a new king, and they had to do it fast. But what could they do? Jesus and his disciples got together to eat the Passover meal, just like they did every year. But this year, Jesus did something different. First, Jesus told his disciples that one of them was going to turn against him by helping the Pharisees and Sadducees arrest him and take him away. All the disciples looked at each other. Who could it be, they wondered. Then Jesus picked up a piece of bread and said, "This is my body, which is given for you." After that, he picked up his cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood, poured out for you." A covenant is a promise, like the promises that God had made to Abraham long, long before. The disciples were confused. It sounded like Jesus was saying God was making a new promise, a new way to bless them and save them, and it had something to do with Jesus' blood and body. It had something to do with Jesus dying? The disciples couldn't believe their ears. Was Jesus saying that he was the new Passover lamb? That he was going to die to save them? But how could Jesus be king if he wasn't even alive? Everyone was confused.
Jesus changed the meaning of Passover. Jesus said, "Now I want you to remember, when you gather together, remember that my blood set you free from being a slave to sin. Like the blood of the lamb set his people free from being slaves to the Egyptians, now Jesus' blood sets us free from being slaves to sin." So one of the things that we do together as a church body is an act of remembrance, that Jesus' blood sets us free from sin, and that's communion. And you may have been in a church service before where families celebrated communion together. Usually there's grape juice or something to drink, and there's a little cracker kind of bread thing, and the pastor or whoever will say, like, "Do this in remembrance of me," that we eat the bread and we remember that Jesus was crucified for us, and we drink the juice and we remember that Jesus' blood sets us free from sin. So, if that's something you'd like to do with your family, I encourage you to do that as an act of remembrance. There are lots of other ways that God tells us to remember. He put a rainbow in the sky in the story of Noah to help us remember that he will keep his promise to never flood the earth again. There's a story in 1 Samuel where the Israelites are crossing the Jordan River, and it's this miracle that God does. And when they get across, he says, "Now build up this pile of stones so that every time you walk by this pile of stones, you don't forget to remember," that's right, "that I brought you across this river." Remembering is very important to God. So find a way that you can remember God every single day. I have a ring that I wear that reminds me to remember and to say thank you to God for all the ways that he loves me and takes care of me. Maybe you like to write in a journal, or you have a chalkboard in your room, or you can just say every day before you go to bed, "Thank you, God, for," and remember one good thing that God has done for you that day. So, don't forget to remember, and you are so loved.